Imagine being handed the keys to a sovereign nation today. You are sitting at the absolute top of the government, and the tasks in front of you are just staggering.
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive undertaking.
Right, because you have to print and manage a stable currency. You have to negotiate these brutal, complex international trade deals with economic giants, like the United States, China, the European Union.
Yeah, you're sitting at the table with the biggest players on Earth.
Exactly. And on top of that, you have to build and maintain a modern healthcare system completely from the ground up.
Yeah.
You have to educate a highly competitive workforce and somehow defend your borders.
Which is, frankly, what every nation-state has to do.
Right. But here is the mind-bending reality of your specific situation. Your entire population, I mean, every single man, woman, and child you are responsible for could comfortably fit into the seats of a single sold-out Major League Baseball stadium.
Yeah, that really puts it into perspective.
And you'd still have a few thousand empty seats left over.
Yeah.
So go ahead and build a billion-dollar economy out of that. I mean, it sounds like an absolute logistical impossibility, right?
It really does.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we are taking a deep dive into a fascinating 2026 academic report. It analyzes the economic and social evolution of St. Kitts and Nevis.
And it's a brilliant report.
It really is. And the timeline we are looking at is incredibly revealing. We're stretching from 1960 all the way to 2023.
That's a huge window of modern history.
Yeah. So our mission for you, the listener, as we go through this analysis, is to discover how a tiny island nation fundamentally rewrote its own economic DNA.
They didn't just survive.
Right. We're going to explore how they didn't just survive the crushing pressures of a globalized world, but engineered a way to genuinely thrive in it.
It does sound like an impossible thought experiment when you frame it that way. But, it is the daily lived reality for what developmental economists call a small island developing state.
A size, right?
Exactly, SIDES for short. And the report we are examining today uses this very specific framework to analyze St. Kitts and Nevis. To understand their trajectory, we really have to understand what it means to be a SIDES.
Because it's not just a label.
No, not at all. When we talk about this classification, we are not just talking about geography. We are talking about a set of incredibly harsh, historically entrenched vulnerabilities.
What kind of vulnerabilities?
Well, these are nations that are geographically isolated. They are disproportionately susceptible to massive environmental disasters. And crucially, they have microscopic domestic markets.
Meaning they just don't have enough people buying things locally.
Right. What this means in practical economic terms is that they cannot rely on the magic of economies of scale.
Okay, break that down for me.
So if you are in a massive country, a corporation can manufacture cars or electronics cheaply. Why? Because they are producing millions of units for an enormous built-in local population.
Makes sense. You have the customer base right outside the factory doors.
Exactly. But in SSIs, you simply do not have the local consumer base to support large-scale domestic manufacturing. It is mathematically unviable.
So they basically have to import everything.
Yes. Almost every single finished good costs significantly more because it has to be imported across an ocean. And anything you manage to export faces steep competitive shipping disadvantages.
So the vulnerability isn't just a phase they go through.
No, it is baked into the very bedrock of the nation.
Man, that is a tough starting point. And before we can really understand the economic leaps this country pulled off, we absolutely have to understand those physical boundaries.
You really do.
Because you can't understand the strategy of a complex game without taking a really hard look at the board you are playing on.
That's a great way to put it.
And the board for St. Kitts and Nevis is, well, it is incredibly intimate. The report lays out the core physical and demographic data points, and they are eye-opening.
The land area alone is staggering to think about.
Yeah, the total land area of the entire country is roughly 260 square kilometers.
Just 260.
Right. For you listening right now, I really want you to try and visualize that footprint. Think about your daily commute to work. Think about your local county, or maybe just a medium-sized city near where you live.
It's tiny.
It is. Imagine taking a marker, drawing a circle around just that small footprint of land, and saying, all right, everything inside this circle is now an independent, sovereign nation.
With its own UN seat and everything.
Exactly. That small patch of Earth is entirely responsible for its own destiny and the population. The report notes that in 2022, the total population was just about 47,700 people.
As you said, fewer people than a baseball stadium.
Right. And to top off this geographical reality, you were dealing with a tropical climate. It brings an annual average rainfall of 1,427 millimeters.
Which is a massive amount of water.
It is nearly 1.5 meters of water pounding the soil every single year. So you have a tiny piece of land, a small group of people, and relentless tropical rain.
It's a very specific environment.
Yeah, and honestly, looking at these severe constraints, I have to push back a little on this whole economic miracle narrative that often gets tossed around.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, if their physical footprint is that tiny, doesn't that inherently doom them to be entirely at the mercy of outside forces? I mean, how can a country of just 47,700 people living on 260 square kilometers have any real agency at all?
That's a very fair question.
Are they actually steering the ship or just, trying not to drown in the wake of larger nations?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your skepticism is entirely justified. And it touches on a foundational concept in developmental economics known as resource endowment limit.
Resource endowment limits. Okay, what is that?
It is exactly what it sounds like. It's a hard, unforgiving physical ceiling on what a nation can naturally pull out of the ground or produce from its own soil.
Because you only have so much dirt to work with.
Exactly. When your entire sovereign territory is only 260 square kilometers, you are physically barred from having vast agricultural or industrial diversity.
All right, you can't have different climate zones.
You cannot have one massive province dedicated to growing wheat, another region raising millions of head of cattle, and a third region mining iron ore or drilling for oil.
You just don't have the space.
Extreme geographical limits fundamentally prevent industrial diversity. And let's think about why that matters.
Okay.
If you are a massive resource-rich nation and the global price of one of your major exports, say soybeans, suddenly drops, your economy can lean on its tech sector or its automotive manufacturing or its energy exports.
You have backups.
Right, you have macroeconomic shock absorbers. But for a small island developing state, that lack of industrial diversity strips away those shock absorbers.
Making every hit feel that much harder.
Yes. It makes you dangerously sensitive to external market shocks and environmental changes. If a single hurricane makes landfall, it doesn't just wipe out one coastal county.
It hits the whole country.
It can devastate the entire national GDP in a matter of hours. Or, if the global market suddenly decides it has found a cheaper supplier for the one specific crop you produce, your entire national economy can immediately go into a tailspin.
Wow, so you are just entirely exposed to the elements in the markets.
You are. So to answer your question directly, yes. Their size and their resource endowment limits make them phenomenally vulnerable.
Which makes their success even crazier to think about.
Exactly. What is so compelling about this 2026 academic report is that it details how St. Kitts and Nevis recognized that trap.
They saw the writing on the wall.
They did. They accepted the harsh reality of their resource endowment limits. And rather than fighting a losing battle against geography, they engineered a highly sophisticated structural pivot to bypass those limits entirely.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual economic trajectory of the nation. Because when you look at the data, they didn't just bypass those limits, they absolutely vaulted over them.
The numbers are remarkable.
Let's dig into the trajectory starting from 1960. As we just established, because they were trapped by a lack of physical land and natural resources, relying on traditional large-scale farming was essentially a dead end.
Both a demographic and economic dead end.
Right. To survive, the nation had to pivot. And when I say pivot, I don't mean they tweaked a few tax policies. I mean they completely incinerated their old economic playbook and wrote a new one from scratch.
A total overhaul.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The sheer scale of the GDP growth we are looking at is staggering. In 1960, the gross domestic product of St. Kitts and Nevis was a mere $12.37 million.
Barely over 12 million.
Hold that number in your head, listener. $12.37 million for an entire nation. Fast forward to 2023. And the current GDP has exploded to $1.12 billion.
With a B.
That is billion with a B. It is an astronomical, almost vertical curve on a chart.
It is, though we do have to account for inflation when looking at a 60-year gap.
Oh, absolutely. Obviously, a dollar in 1960 had vastly different purchasing power than a dollar in 2023. The authors of the report know this, so they also provide the real growth metrics.
Right, stripping away inflation.
Exactly, stripping it away and indexing everything to constant 2015 prices to give us the true expansion of productivity. And even when you look at those inflation-adjusted numbers, the real growth is phenomenal.
What were those adjusted numbers?
In 1990, the real GDP was $194 million. By 2022, that number had surged to $577 million in constant 2015 prices.
So they effectively tripled their real tangible economic output in just over 3 decades.
Yes. But the truly fascinating story hidden in this report isn't just that the amount of money went up, it's the radical transformation of how that money was generated.
The structural pivot.
Right. The data reveals a massive agricultural crash. The agriculture value-added growth was incredibly volatile over the decades. The report highlights that at one point, it suffered a catastrophic crash of negative 32.17%.
Almost a third of the sector's value just vanishing.
It's just gone.
Hmm.
At the same time, a completely different sector was rising to dominance. The service economy surged. It consistently stayed above 60% of the total GDP and eventually reached a massive 74.22% in 2023.
A total flip of the economy.
Exactly. So we have an agrarian sector that literally collapses by a third of its value and a service sector that balloons to represent nearly three-quarters of the entire national economy.
It's a huge shift.
We really need to unpack the actual mechanics of this.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you take a nation of farmers and turn them into a service economy without the whole society collapsing in the interim?
Well, the transition you are describing is arguably the most profound structural shift a modern economy can undergo. And it is rarely a smooth or painless process.
I can imagine.
To understand the mechanics, we have to look at what they were transitioning away from. For generations, the economy of St. Kitts and Nevis was inextricably, intimately linked to sugarcane production.
A classic colonial-era agricultural model.
Exactly. Sugarcane dominated the physical landscape and the labor force. But let's apply those resource constraints we discussed earlier to the sugar industry. Agriculture, especially a monocrop like sugar, requires vast, sweeping expanses of land. When you only have 260 square kilometers of sovereign territory, every single hectare of cane field is a hectare you cannot use for something else.
Like housing or businesses.
Right. You can't use it for residential housing, commercial infrastructure, or modern businesses. You are locking up your most precious resource, which is land, in a low-yield endeavor.
That makes a lot of sense.
Furthermore, agriculture leaves you entirely at the mercy of the weather. We mentioned that 1,427 millimeters of annual average rainfall earlier.
The meter and a half of rain.
Right. In farming, timing is everything. If that rain doesn't fall during the critical growth window, or if a tropical storm dumps half of that annual rainfall in a single weekend accompanied by hurricane-force winds, your crop is ruined.
Your entire year's work is just gone.
Your entire GDP for the year is literally washed into the sea or flattened into the mud. That catastrophic crash of negative 32.17% in agriculture value-added growth is the mathematical expression of that extreme vulnerability.
It's the moment the risk caught up with them.
Yes. It is the violent realization that tying a nation's 21st century survival to the soil and the weather is a losing bet. So the government and the private sector made a deliberate, incredibly difficult, and culturally fraught choice.
They decided to walk away from sugar.
They decided to transition aggressively away from the sugar estates. They pivoted toward becoming a service-driven powerhouse, specifically focusing on high-end tourism and international financial services.
But why services specifically? Why not manufacturing?
Because high-value services are inherently borderless. They do not rely on acreage. An international financial services firm, a boutique digital consultancy, or a luxury resort does not need 10,000 hectares of arable land to generate massive wealth.
They just need smart people and an internet connection.
Exactly. They rely on human brains, exceptional customer experience, and global digital connectivity. By shifting their capital and their focus to services, they actively decoupled their economic growth from the physical limits of their geography.
That is so smart. They stopped playing the game they couldn't win.
They stopped trying to export raw physical goods that required massive land and cheap manual labor. Instead, they started exporting experiences, security, and expertise.
Wow.
When we see the service sector hit 74.22% of GDP in 2023, we are looking at the culmination of a decades-long deliberate strategy to construct an economy that is essentially weightless.
Man, I love that phrasing. An economy that is weightless. It paints exactly the right picture in your mind.
It really does.
You aren't loading massive, heavy crates of sugar onto cargo ships anymore. You are welcoming high-net-worth tourists at the airport and moving digital capital across fiber optic cables.
A completely different world.
But, and there is always a but, when we look at these sweeping economic transformations, transitioning to a service economy doesn't magically summon physical goods into existence.
No, it certainly doesn't.
If your entire workforce is running hotels and managing financial portfolios, nobody is growing the food. Nobody's manufacturing the cars, the concrete, the medical supplies, or the clothing.
Right. If you don't make it, you have to ship it in.
And this brings us to what the report outlines as the incredibly steep price of this paradise. A deep, entrenched, structural, external dependency. Let's look at the trade numbers from the report because they are jarring.
The import scale is massive.
It is absolutely massive for a country this size. In 2022, the nation imported $669 million in goods and services.
Over $500 million just in imports.
Because they are relentlessly importing so much more physical stuff than they are exporting, their trade balance is chronically, deeply negative. The net trade for goods and services was negative $130 million in 2022 alone.
That's a huge deficit.
It is. This constant need to buy the necessities of life from the outside world drives a current account balance that sat at a staggering negative $169 million in 2022.
Which is hard to sustain.
To put this into a relatable analogy for you, think of it exactly like a household in your neighborhood. This household buys all of its groceries, all of its cars, all of its clothing, and all of its appliances from the neighbors.
Right.
The household doesn't grow a single tomato or sew a single shirt. It only generates income by hosting really spectacular high-ticket dinner parties for paying guests, which represents the tourism and service sector.
It's a great analogy.
Now, a household can theoretically run like that, provided people keep paying premium prices for the dinner parties, and provided banks keep lending them money to renovate the dining room.
But that's a big if.
Exactly. And here's the terrifying part of the data. To finance all of this, the country relies heavily on foreign direct investment, or FDI.
The money flowing in from the outside.
Yes, the money flowing in to build those resorts and infrastructure. The report literally characterizes this as an FDI roller coaster.
Because of how much it fluctuates.
Yes. At one point, FDI hit a staggering high of 22.45% of the nation's entire GDP. That is a massive, life-altering influx of foreign capital.
22% is huge.
But recently, it has shown extreme volatility, plummeting all the way down to just 1.95% in 2022.
From 22.45% down to under 2%.
Right. So I have to challenge the core stability of this model. If I am looking at this 1.95% FDI number, it looks like a recipe for a death spiral.
It certainly looks alarming on paper.
If you have an economy that requires importing $669 million in goods just to survive, and the foreign investors who usually build your infrastructure pack up and leave, the math simply doesn't work. How did the state not just outright collapse in 2022?
It's a precarious situation.
Did they just trade the volatility of the weather for the volatility of Wall Street?
It is a phenomenal question, and you are hitting on the central structural anxiety of the small island developing state model. Did they trade the volatility of the weather for the volatility of the global markets? Yes, they absolutely did.
Wow.
But the key difference is that while a hurricane destroys your infrastructure, a drop in foreign investment just stalls its expansion. It is a precarious balancing act, though. Let's unpack the mechanics of how a country survives when that investment dries up.
Please do, because the math is stressing me out.
Well, when a nation is running a chronic trade deficit, generating that negative $130 million trade balance because it imports more than it exports, it has to finance that deficit somehow.
Right, the bills have to be paid.
The money to pay the international shipping companies for that $669 million in food, fuel, and vehicles has to come from somewhere. For a highly service-based SIDs, foreign direct investment is the absolute lifeblood of capital accumulation.
So what does that look like in practice?
Let's visualize what FDI actually looks like on the ground. It isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. FDI is a Canadian hospitality conglomerate wiring $50 million to local banks.
To build something.
Exactly. To buy concrete, hire local electricians, and employ hundreds of local construction workers to build a 300-room luxury resort on the beach.
So it's real, tangible economic activity.
Yes, that money flows directly into the local economy. It creates immediate construction jobs, upgrades the local power grid, and eventually, once open, generates long-term tourism revenue.
So when it was at 22.45%.
FDI was at that staggering high of 22.45% of GDP. The country was awash in external capital. The government and local businesses had plenty of foreign currency to easily cover their massive import bills and fund their development goals.
But then the roller coaster drops.
Right. As you noted, FDI is notoriously ruthlessly fickle.
Yeah.
It is incredibly sensitive to the macro global investment climate.
Like what kind of factors?
If there is a recession in North America or Europe, or a global pandemic, or even just a sudden spike in interest rates set by the U.S. Federal Reserve, those multinational corporations immediately pull back on their global expansion plans.
They just cancel the resort.
They decide not to build that new resort. And when that happens, the FDI plummets to 1.95%, as we saw in 2022. The pipeline of easy capital instantly dries up.
But they still need to eat.
Exactly. The brutal reality is that the country still has to import its food and its diesel fuel. That $669 million import bill doesn't magically vanish just because investors got spooked.
So how do they actually stay afloat?
First, they have to draw down on their national foreign exchange reserves. They are essentially dipping into the national savings account.
Okay, that buys some time.
Second, the government often has to step in and take on sovereign debt, borrowing money internationally to keep the currency stable and the imports flowing.
Which adds more pressure.
Third, and most importantly, they have to lean incredibly heavily on the domestic revenues generated by the service sector that is already built and operational.
The hotels that are already there have to keep performing.
Yes. The resorts that are already open have to keep bringing in tourists. This dynamic forces the government to operate with incredibly strict financial discipline. Because when FDI drops to under 2%, the national margin for error essentially vanishes.
That sounds incredibly stressful for a government to manage.
It is. The roller coaster of foreign capital perfectly illustrates the ultimate trade-off of their pivot. A service economy absolutely frees you from the physical limits of your own small patch of land, but it chains your survival entirely to the health, the confidence, and the whims of the global economy.
And while the macroeconomic indicators are doing these massive structural gymnastics,
Right.
shutting down the sugar fields, building the luxury resorts, managing chronic trade deficits, and desperately trying to ride out the FDI roller coaster.
There's a human element to all of this.
Exactly. We have to look at the collateral impact. What was happening to the actual human beings living inside this rapidly transforming economy?
It changed everything about how they lived.
Right, because as the nation got richer, and as they successfully jumped to $1 billion GDP, the very structure of the family unit completely transformed. Moving an entire workforce from the fields to the cities triggered an unintended, almost invisible crisis inside the home.
The demographic shift.
Yeah. The report covers this in what they describe as the demographic time bomb. Let's look at the raw numbers of human life on the island, because they tell a story of rapid stagnation and aging.
What do the growth rates look like?
First, the overall population growth is flatlining. By 2022, the growth rate had dropped to a mere 0.1%. The population is barely replacing itself.
Just 0.1%.
Second, the spatial distribution of the people is radically shifting due to urbanization. The report shows that rural population growth has been chronically negative as citizens steadily flock away from the countryside and into the urban centers.
Which makes sense given the jobs.
Right. People are abandoning the agricultural villages, which makes total logical sense if all the jobs have moved to the service sectors in the cities.
It's a natural migration.
But the most staggering, consequential data point in this entire section is what we can call the dependency ratio flip.
The dependency ratio, that's a critical metric.
Yeah, for the listener, the dependency ratio is an economic metric that measures the number of people who are generally not in the typical working age bracket. So young children and the elderly.
Right, the dependents.
Right, compared to the working age population that has to financially support them. In 1960, during the agrarian era, the child dependency ratio was a massive 92.4%.
Almost a 1-to-1 ratio of kids to workers?
Fast forward to 2022, and that child dependency ratio has plummeted to 25.7%.
Wow.
That is an absolute free fall in the number of children being born and raised.
Massive drop.
Meanwhile, the exact opposite is happening on the other end of the age spectrum. The old age dependency ratio climbed from 10.2% in 1960 to 16.9% in 2022. That represents a 6.7% increase in the elderly burden on the workforce.
So what does this all mean for the daily reality of the country?
Well, think of the economy like a massive seesaw. In 1960, the working-age adults are standing right in the middle, trying to balance an enormous, overwhelming weight of children on one side of the seesaw.
Okay, I see where this is going.
By 2022, the vast majority of those children have hopped off, but an increasingly heavy group of retirees has jumped onto the exact opposite side. The workers are still stuck in the middle, still bearing a heavy load, but the nature of the weight they are carrying has completely changed.
The societal needs totally shift.
Exactly. You are physically seeing fewer playgrounds being built, elementary schools are seeing their enrollments shrink, and maternity wards are quieter. But simultaneously, there is a sudden, desperate, and growing need for more retirement facilities, specialized geriatric health care, dialysis machines, and wheelchair-accessible infrastructure in these rapidly growing urban centers.
The infrastructure demand flips.
The entire shape and requirement of society has turned upside down in a single human lifetime.
That seesaw analogy is perfectly apt. What the demographic data is illustrating here is a textbook, highly accelerated example of the demographic transition model, and it is crucial to understand why this happens.
Okay, walk us through the why.
In the first phase of this model, which is typically associated with agrarian societies, exactly like St. Kitts and Nevis back in 1960, you see very high birth rates paired with high death rates.
Because farming requires lots of hands.
Exactly. In a farming economy, children are fundamentally viewed as an economic asset. That is the driving force behind that massive 92.4% child dependency ratio. Families needed a large number of children to work the fields, harvest the cane, and contribute to the household's manual labor output.
They were quite literally part of the workforce.
They were. But as the economy modernizes, as the nation executes that pivot to a service economy, the underlying calculus of family planning changes entirely.
Because you don't need kids to harvest a hotel room.
Right. When a family moves from a rural farm to an urban apartment to work in tourism or finance, children transition from being an economic asset in the fields to being a significant economic cost in the city.
Oh, that makes total sense. They become an expense.
They require years of expensive education and upbringing before they possess the soft skills and analytical abilities to enter a high-skill service workforce. Consequently, as the economic incentive to have large families evaporates, birth rates plunge dramatically.
Wow.
That is the exact mechanism driving the child dependency ratio down to 25.7%.
And the elderly side of the equation.
Concurrently, because the nation is generating more wealth and public health care is vastly improved, people are surviving well past their working years. Lifespans extend significantly.
Which is a good thing.
It is a wonderful human achievement. But economically, it naturally drives the old age dependency ratio up by that 6.7% to reach 16.9%. This creates a profound structural shift in the societal burden.
The workers are carrying a different load.
Yes. The working age population is no longer primarily tasked with feeding and raising a vast, sprawling generation of children. Instead, the economic and social burden shifts heavily toward caring for a rapidly growing population of elders who are no longer producing economic output.
And they're all moving to the cities.
Right. When you combine this with the urbanization trend you mentioned, where chronic negative rural growth means the youth have left the villages, all of these aging individuals are increasingly concentrated in urban centers.
Or left behind.
Exactly. Or conversely, left isolated in rural areas without younger family members to care for them. This creates immense complex challenges for the distribution of public services.
Because the government has to adapt to where the people are and what they need.
The government cannot simply operate on autopilot. They have to rapidly and efficiently reallocate tax revenue away from expanding rural pediatric care and building new primary schools, and redirect those funds toward urban adult social care.
Funding pensions and hospitals.
Yes, funding complex national pension systems and managing the expensive long-term chronic diseases associated with old age, like diabetes and heart disease.
It's a totally different healthcare model.
It is a slow-moving demographic time bomb that requires deep, forward-looking structural planning to diffuse. Otherwise, the healthcare and pension systems simply collapse under the weight of the elderly.
And realizing that this demographic time bomb is ticking brings us to what I think is the most inspiring, but also the most ruthlessly necessary part of this nation's survival strategy.
The investment in people.
Yes. Facing a population growth rate that is flatlining at 0.1%, facing a growing burden of elderly citizens, and knowing for an absolute fact that they have zero natural resources to dig out of the ground to sell, St. Kitts and Nevis realized their only viable path forward was maximizing the economic and intellectual potential of every single citizen.
They had no other choice, really.
None. If you only have a talent pool of 47,700 people to run an entire country, you simply cannot afford to have a single person uneducated, marginalized, or unhealthy. They had to build a human capital engine.
And the data shows they really committed to it.
Oh, totally. The education outcomes detailed in the report are nothing short of phenomenal. For instance, the female primary graduation rates are routinely over 100%.
Over 100%.
The data notes that in 2022, it hit an incredible 115.16%.
Now, obviously, a listener might hear that and think, wait, mathematically, how can a graduation rate be over 100%?
Right, that doesn't make sense on the surface.
Right. But the report clarifies that this data factors in overage and returning students.
Which is amazing.
It is. What this actually means on the ground is that not only are all the young girls currently in the system graduating, but older women who were perhaps marginalized, forced into domestic labor, or simply missed out on education in past decades are actively returning to the classroom to get their degrees.
The societal hunger for learning and upskilling is pervasive.
It's a cultural shift.
And the quality inside those classrooms backs up this ambition. The pupil-teacher ratios vastly improved over the decades. They dropped from a crowded 25.1 students per teacher down to an intimate, highly focused 13 students per teacher.
13 students to a teacher is fantastic.
You are basically getting small group private school level instruction in the public school system. Then, you look at the health miracles they achieved alongside this education push.
The health data is equally impressive.
The under-5 child mortality rate dropped from 63.7 deaths per 1,000 live births back in 1973, all the way down to a staggering 10.3 in 2023.
That is a massive reduction.
Imagine the human triumph of seeing child mortality drop by a factor of 6 within a single lifetime. Add to that a disease control system that currently boasts a 100% detection rate for infectious diseases like tuberculosis.
100% detection.
They are leaving absolutely no stone unturned when it comes to the health of their people.
This raises an important question, though, doesn't it?
What's that?
We've painted a picture of a small island nation that is highly exposed to volatile foreign investment, running massive trade deficits, and struggling with an aging population. How did a country with those constraints actually afford to accomplish these world-class health and education metrics?
Yeah, good point. Because doubling your teaching staff isn't cheap.
Not at all. The answer lies in the government's fierce, unwavering commitment to what the authors term an education-driven development paradigm.
Education-driven.
The report carefully breaks down the high per capita government expenditure on education. The government didn't just casually throw money at the problem. They made a conscious, strategic decision to allocate a massively disproportionate amount of their limited national wealth specifically toward human development.
Because humans were their only resource.
Exactly. Let's look at the logistics of what that actually entails. When you lower a national pupil-teacher ratio from 25.1 to 13, you aren't just rearranging desks, you are effectively doubling your entire national teaching workforce.
You have to pay all those new salaries.
That requires immense sustained capital for salaries, ongoing pedagogical training, and the physical infrastructure of building more classrooms.
And the health side.
Similarly, driving the under-5 child mortality rate down from 63.7 to 10.3 doesn't happen by accident. It requires the rollout of robust, accessible prenatal care clinics across the island, widespread and rigidly enforced vaccination programs, and the cultivation of a highly trained medical staff.
Which, again, costs a lot of money.
Achieving a 100% detection rate for an infectious disease like tuberculosis requires a public health apparatus that is granular, proactive, and deeply integrated into the community. It means community nurses who know every family, who can perform rigorous contact tracing, and who can ensure medication compliance.
It's an entirely preventative mindset.
The economic logic behind spending so heavily on this is flawless, even if it is incredibly difficult to execute politically when budgets are tight. Think back to the economic pivot we discussed earlier.
The move to services.
Right. A service economy, which relies on international finance, high-end luxury tourism, and digital services, does not run on manual labor or physical strength. It runs entirely on human brains.
You need a different kind of worker entirely.
It requires advanced soft skills, analytical thinking, linguistic capabilities, and a healthy, reliable professional workforce. The high human capital reserves generated by these massive investments in education and public health become the absolute, irreplaceable fuel for the service economy.
So the education wasn't just a nice societal bonus, it was the economic engine.
If the government had failed to invest in their people, if they had left their citizens undereducated and unhealthy, the grand transition from sugar to services would have stalled completely.
Because nobody would be able to do the new jobs.
They would have built the luxury hotels, but had no one qualified to manage them. They would have opened the banks, but had no one to run the software. They would have had no product to offer the global market.
That is profound.
By treating the minds and bodies of their citizens as their primary, most valuable natural resource, they created a self-sustaining engine of economic value.
I really want to linger on that execution aspect because,
Yeah.
as you said, education and health miracles do not happen by accident.
Definitely not.
You don't accidentally have your classroom sizes, and you certainly don't accidentally wipe out child mortality. Doing those things requires deeply functional, highly reliable institutions.
Strong governance.
Exactly. In a tiny nation of 47,700 people, the margin for institutional error is practically zero. A few profoundly bad decisions at the top levels of government, a corrupt official siphoning funds, or a breakdown in the basic rule of law can collapse the entire state apparatus.
It can undo decades of progress overnight.
And it can instantly scare away that crucial 1.95% of foreign investment. This makes robust governance the ultimate foundational safety net for everything we've talked about so far.
And the report measures this, right?
It does. The report provides quantitative data on this by looking at the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI, for St. Kitts and Nevis. These metrics measure how well a state actually functions.
Let's hear the numbers.
Their control of corruption sits at roughly the 64.6th percentile globally. The rule of law is evaluated at the 66.0 percentile, and their voice and accountability metric is at a very impressive 72.0 percentile.
Those are solid metrics for a developing nation.
Alongside these institutional metrics, the report highlights that the government has been aggressively expanding social insurance coverage across all income deciles. That means they are building safety nets that stretch from the poorest 20% of the population all the way up to the richest 20%.
Broad coverage.
Now, I have to pause here and ask you to translate this for us, because we need context. When my high school brain hears a number like the 64th percentile, I immediately think, oh, a 64, that's a D grade. That is barely passing, maybe even failing.
That's a very common misconception with percentiles.
Are these percentile rankings actually good for a developing nation, or is this a vulnerability?
It is a vital clarification, and it is essential to understand exactly how these percentiles function in a global comparative context. A percentile ranking in the worldwide governance indicators does not mean you took a test and scored a 64 out of 100.
Okay, so what does it mean?
It means that St. Kitts and Nevis performs better in controlling corruption than 64.6% of all the other sovereign countries on Earth.
Oh, wow. Okay, that changes the perspective entirely.
When you reframe it that way, you realize that punching above the 60th and 70th percentiles globally in governance is a massive structural competitive advantage. This is especially true for a developing island nation.
Because many nations struggle with that.
The unfortunate reality of global development is that many post-colonial or developing nations struggle for decades just to break out of the bottom 30th percentile in these exact metrics, often plagued by instability and graft.
Right.
By firmly establishing themselves in the 66th percentile for rule of law, the government of St. Kitts and Nevis is broadcasting a clear, verifiable, and highly lucrative signal to the international community.
A signal to investors.
They are telling global capital markets, if you bring your foreign direct investment here, your commercial contracts will be strictly enforced by impartial courts, your physical property rights will be respected, and you will not be subjected to arbitrary shakedowns by local officials.
Which is exactly what a hospitality conglomerate needs to hear before wiring $50 million.
Exactly. This verified level of governance ensures high regulatory quality, which is the only reason international banks and hotel chains are willing to risk their capital there. And if we connect this back to the demographic time bomb we discussed earlier.
The aging population.
Right, where the old age dependency ratio climbed to 16.9%. Strong governance is the literal only reason the country hasn't buckled under the weight of its aging citizens.
How does governance tie into the elderly care?
Because they possess highly functional institutions and maintain high political accountability, evidenced by that 72.0 percentile in voice and accountability, the state possessed the administrative competence to successfully design and roll out robust contributory pension plans.
They actually had the systems in place to collect and distribute the money.
Yes. They were able to expand complex social insurance programs across all income deciles fairly. Think about the level of trust required for that. You simply cannot mandate, collect, and manage a national pension system if the working population does not inherently trust the government to hold their money safely for 3 or 4 decades without stealing it.
That's so true. If corruption is rampant, no one is paying into a national pension fund.
Exactly. The governance metrics aren't just dry political science data. They are the invisible, load-bearing bedrock that allows the healthcare systems, the public schools, the pension payouts, and the foreign investment to actually function and thrive.
That concept of the load-bearing bedrock perfectly sets up the final and perhaps the most complex dilemma facing the nation today.
The environmental cost.
Yes. They have successfully built a relatively wealthy, highly educated, service-based economy on the bedrock of solid governance. They survived the pivot. But modern economic growth always comes with a receipt.
It always does.
There is always an environmental cost to industrialization and modernization. And for a tiny island nation, climate change is not some theoretical debate for a university classroom. It is a literal, existential threat to their physical existence.
Sea level rise is very real for a SID.
This brings us to the carbon paradox and the fascinating economic concept of true wealth, which economists attempt to measure using a metric called adjusted net savings. Let's look closely at the environmental data.
Let's hear it.
The greenhouse gas emissions, excluding land use changes, which is often abbreviated as LULUCF in the data, grew from a mere 0.05 Mount teeth CO2e in 1990 to 0.134 in 2021.
So their emissions more than doubled.
Yes. As the nation got richer and as the GDP exploded to over $1 billion, their carbon footprint more than doubled. Meanwhile, their transition to clean energy has been concerningly slow.
How slow?
Non-hydro renewable energy sources only even appeared on the data charts around 2015, generating roughly 10.34 million kilowatt hours. Currently, renewables represent an incredibly small fraction, only about 4.5% of their total energy mix.
Just 4.5%. That leaves a huge fossil fuel dependency.
Now, to understand why this is a crisis, let's look at the adjusted net savings. This is a brilliant paradigm-shifting concept. Think of adjusted net savings as the ultimate national bank account.
I like that analogy.
But instead of just looking at the raw cash in the vault, which is what GDP does, this metric counts the growth of human brain power and education as actual financial deposits. And it counts environmental pollution and resource depletion as literal financial withdrawals.
It measures sustainable wealth.
The report calculates that the government's heavy education expenditures add roughly 2.6% to the gross national income, or GNI. That acts as a massive deposit of true sustainable wealth.
Right, the human capital.
But the economic damage caused by their CO2 emissions subtracts about 0.x% from the GNI. The report literally uses the phrase 0.x% here, meaning it's a fraction of a percent.
It seems small, but it adds up.
Exactly. It might seem like a marginal fluctuating decimal, but it represents a steady, relentless withdrawal from their true national wealth. So they're depositing human capital into the bank every day by educating their citizens, but they are simultaneously withdrawing environmental stability by burning fossil fuels.
The paradox of development.
Wait, before we dive deeper into the solution, I need to make sure we are all tracking here. What exactly is LULUCF? It sounds like a hipster coffee shop, but I assume it's critical to the carbon math.
It does sound like an acronym you'd find on a menu, but LULUCF is incredibly important when calculating a nation's true environmental impact. It stands for land use change, and forestry.
Oh, okay. So it's about the physical land itself.
Essentially, it measures how the physical alteration of the Earth itself affects carbon levels. If you chop down a dense, carbon-absorbing forest and pave it over with concrete to build a luxury resort, that land use change releases carbon and removes a natural carbon sink.
It's a double whammy.
Conversely, if you plant a massive forest on an abandoned sugarcane field, that land use absorbs carbon. So when the data says their emissions grew to 0.134 millet CO2e excluding LULUCF, it means that is the raw pollution coming from tailpipes, power plants, and industry, regardless of what they are doing with their trees.
Okay, that clarifies things.
And this perfectly synthesizes the agonizing tension inherent in their current stage of development. The paradox is that the country's carbon footprint is climbing in absolute lockstep with its GDP.
Because running a service economy requires power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To run a high-end, modern service economy, you require absolutely massive, uninterrupted amounts of electricity. Luxury hotels require 247 air conditioning and tropical heat. Massive water desalination plants require immense power to provide clean water to tourists.
And the data centers and banks?
And the digital infrastructure required for international finance demands constant, flawless energy. Right now, because renewables are stuck at that 4.5% mark, roughly 95.5% of that necessary energy is being generated by burning imported fossil fuels.
Which hits them financially and environmentally.
This creates a terrifying dual threat for the nation. First, they are actively contributing to the very global climate change and sea level rise that threatens to physically swallow their 260 square kilometers of land.
Literally sinking their own country.
Second, it makes them economically hyper-vulnerable to global oil price shocks. Every time the price of a barrel of oil spikes globally, millions of dollars bleed out of their economy just to keep the lights on.
So they are trapped by their energy needs.
The ultimate, most pressing recommendation of this 2026 academic report is the urgent, non-negotiable need to deepen renewable energy usage. The strict mathematical logic of the adjusted net savings makes the path forward clear.
What's the plan?
To grow true, sustainable wealth, a nation must maximize its deposits, which St. Kitts and Nevis is doing brilliantly with that 2.6% GNI addition from their human capital investments. And it must aggressively eliminate its withdrawals, specifically the economic damage caused by carbon emissions.
So how do they solve this catch-22?
They have to close the economic loop by leveraging their excellent governance metrics. They need to use that 66th percentile rule of law and that 72nd percentile, voice and accountability, to actively court and attract high-quality green tech foreign direct investment.
Oh, use the governance to solve the energy crisis.
Exactly. This brilliant strategy actually solves the terrifying problem we discussed earlier, where FDI dropped to 1.95%.
It creates a new sector for investment.
By creating a legally attractive, highly stable regulatory environment for international solar, wind, and geothermal investors, they can bring in the capital they desperately need to boost their FDI.
It hits all the birds with one stone.
It solves their massive trade imbalance by drastically reducing the need to import expensive diesel fuel and completely decarbonizes their energy grid to protect their island from the ravages of climate change. It is an elegant, comprehensive solution to a multi-layered existential threat.
It truly is an incredible holistic roadmap for survival in the 21st century. Let's do a rapid-fire recap of the three main pillars we've uncovered today from this deep analysis.
Sounds good.
Pillar number one is the sheer incredible achievement of their economic pivot. They looked at the resource endowment limit of their 260 square kilometers, abandoned a highly volatile agricultural sector that once crashed by a devastating 32.17%, and successfully grew a sophisticated, weightless service economy.
Which now makes up 74.22% of their $1.12 billion GDP.
Exactly. Pillar number two highlights the looming, deeply interconnected challenges of their success. They're forced to manage a severe trade dependency with $669 million in imports.
And navigate the demographic time bomb.
Right, an aging population where the old-age dependency ratio has risen by 6.7%, and grapple with a carbon footprint that has climbed to 0.134 Mount CO2e as they modernized.
And the final pillar.
Pillar number three is the visionary path forward. They are fighting back against these constraints by maintaining over 100% female primary graduation rates, crushing child mortality down to an astonishing 10.3, and utilizing top-tier global governance to attract the crucial green tech FDI needed to transition their grid away from imported fossil fuels.
It is a literal masterclass in sovereign survival and adaptation.
It truly is a masterclass. What this comprehensive report outlines is nothing short of a new, highly effective, education-driven paradigm for small island developing states.
Absolutely. When faced with geographic limitations, they systematically substituted the natural resources they did not have with the high-quality human resources they carefully, deliberately cultivated.
Which proves a major point.
It is the ultimate proof that while geography is a severe constraint, it absolutely does not have to be a destiny.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on as we wrap up our analysis. We have just spent the last hour meticulously looking at the data, the struggles, and the triumphs of a microstate of just 47,700 people.
A tiny, highly exposed population.
They are severely, physically constrained by geography, completely and utterly exposed to the ruthless whims of the global financial market, and existentially threatened by the changing weather patterns of the globe.
Yet they thrived.
Yet, through sheer political will and strategic investment, they managed to fundamentally rewrite their economic destiny by investing heavily, relentlessly, in the minds and the health of their everyday citizens.
It's incredibly inspiring.
So if an island nation with fewer people than a baseball stadium can figure out how to structurally drive child mortality into the floor, shrink their class sizes to elite levels, and completely pivot an entire national economy away from the fields and into the future,
Yeah.
what does that say about the endless excuses made by massive, resource-rich nations that somehow failed to do the same for their own people?
That's a profound question to leave on.
Think about that the next time you hear a politician on the news claim that a social problem is simply too big to solve. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.